Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're excited to have joining us the filmmakers of the documentary short, The Undocumented Lawyer. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we are trying something new on the podcast. We're having non-lawyer guests. Please join me in welcoming Chris Temple and Zach Ingrasci to the podcast. Chris and Zach are filmmakers and the founders of Optimist, a nonprofit production studio. They are the best known for directing the feature documentaries Living on $1 and Salam Neighbor. Their films have been acquired by HBO, Netflix, Amazon Prime, National Geographic, and The Atlantic. Their 2020 short documentary, The Undocumented Lawyer, premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival and will premiere on HBO in 2021. What's cool about them is every film that they make is accompanied by an impact campaign to create measurable outcomes. Their projects have raised over $91.5 million for the film's causes and have changed over 275,000 lives. I was first introduced to Chris and Zach's work about a decade ago, which always makes me feel old when I say things like a decade ago. When they premiered their film, Living on $1, we are all alumni of Claremont McKenna College, which is how I learned about the work they were doing. So Chris and Zach, thank you so much for joining me. And this may be the first time we have a full CMCer podcast on the Law School Toolbox. Woohoo!
Thanks so much for having us. We're excited to talk with you about the film and learn more.
So I'm so excited to have you guys talk about this documentary short, The Undocumented Lawyer, which you were kind enough to share with me the other week, so I got like a sneak peek, pre-HBO, I guess. To be honest, I hadn't thought that much about whether or not an undocumented law grad could get admitted to the state bar. And for all I know, I actually know undocumented lawyers myself. I just, of course, never ask a lawyer if they are undocumented. I'm sure that most people do not. But of course, after I saw the film, I had to go become my copious researching self. I did some digging about this and found out that California was actually the first state to allow undocumented immigrants to practice law. The first person who pushed this forward was Sergio Garza. He was the first undocumented immigrant in the U.S. to have bar membership, and he graduated from law school in 2009 and passed the California bar. So he and I were actually in law school at the same time. And then he took his case to the California Supreme Court, and in 2013, so quite a few years after he passed the bar, poor guy, they said it was going to be up to the legislature to decide if he can practice law. So he went to the legislature and lobbied, and a bill was overwhelmingly passed authorizing the Supreme Court to admit qualified applicants not lawfully present in the U.S. to practice law in California. So he became the first person eligible to practice law in 2014. And they now estimate over a dozen attorneys have admitted to California under this rule. And like most things in the law, there was a ripple effect. And so the ABA then passed a resolution in 2017 declaring that bar admission should not be denied based solely on immigration status. And then a few other interesting facts, because I read a lot of articles when I was preparing for this podcast. Sergio Garcia was honored with a Medal of Valor by then Attorney General Kamala Harris in 2014, and now has earned his citizenship and voted for the first time in November of 2020. I wonder who he voted for. I don't know. I mean, I won't assume, but, you know. And he also mentioned in the article I read about voting in 2020 that he plans to run for public office. So maybe you guys have another documentary coming up. Yes. Who knows?
Hey, this sounds like a promising lead for a great story in a documentary
I
film.
know. So, of course, as we were talking about ripple effects, by the list I found, it seems like Arizona, Florida, Illinois, Nebraska, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Utah, and Wyoming all have now similar rules. And interestingly enough, undocumented immigrants can use the rules of California or these other states to become licensed and then practice immigration law in any state, which comes out of federal law. So, you know, it was just fascinating to me that there's this kind of whole background of trying to support DACA recipients to become practicing lawyers that I think really hasn't been discussed, because I consider myself to be somewhat in the know of what's happening in the legal world, and I had never really seen this before.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's also not only just DACA recipients. Lisbeth, the main character of this film, actually didn't qualify for DACA because of some of her activism work in the past. So it's really this idea that your integrity to uphold the law is not dependent on your immigration status. So it's when we met Lisbeth, we met her because we actually were working on another film about this young boy from Guatemala who was fighting for SID, a special immigrant juvenile visa, and seeing him, navigate the immigration legal space was wild. Not being guaranteed a lawyer. Like, we were in immigration court, and we were seeing kids represent themselves in front of judges, and it was shocking. And as we learned more about this kid Luis's case, we reached out to lawyers nearby, and we had just read this New York Times article about Lisbeth and her experience as an undocumented person. We thought it would be good to reach out to her because of her activism and kind of blend of activism and law. And we just had this conversation that just opened our eyes to a whole new world and story. And we realized that her story itself should be its own film.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. When I was practicing law, I did some pro bono asylum work that my firm facilitated for us. And I went to immigration court in San Francisco a few times with my client. And I, as an English-speaking, educated, fully privileged white woman, I'm standing in this courtroom totally intimidated by the what is happening around me, the fact that everything is moving so fast, the fact that, the way that the judge is speaking to all of us, and, just really had such an impact of everyone who was sitting in that room and how humbling that experience is. If I felt, intimidated and overwhelmed, what is somebody who can't even follow what's happening in court and then has their future relying on what happens in that room? I feel like everybody should have to have that experience of watching what the immigration system is like before they can make judgment on, how immigrants move within our country.
And then you see, when you see how difficult it is, you understand kind of some of the stats behind it too. And, if you're if you have representation, you're 10 times more likely to be able to stay in the US. And things like that, you're like, yes, if you are a 10-year-old trying to defend yourself in court to, one of these topics that's so complex, you understand why why this is such a challenge. And then you look at the demand side just continues to increase too. You're looking now at 80% of detained immigrants don't have lawyers. And so, I think one of our big goals of this film too is just, in Lisbeth's goal, is to encourage more people to go into this field to become immigration lawyers and to continue that work, because there's this huge demand.
There is. I know one of the people I used to practice law with now works for KIND, Kids in Need of Legal Defense, down in the Central Valley, which is where I'm from. And, I'm always so compelled to hear about the work that she's doing because, the uncertainty that surrounds children. And I'm a mom. I have 2 little kids. The idea that my kids would ever be in a situation where they didn't feel safe and they didn't feel protected, it's just horrifying. So there's so much work that needs to be done. And I think that the exciting thing about films like this is that, you might show it to a young person, a young college student, and it might want them to take on this kind of work because it is a challenge. It's a challenging area of the law to be a part of, but I think you have to really feel called to it.
Yeah, and I think Lisbeth is hoping to be, an inspiration herself to other undocumented students who might not believe that they have any path to head into law or into government or into these other positions. And in many ways, you talked about Sergio Garcia earlier, who was an inspiration for Lisbeth of kind of being this trailblazer as the first undocumented person with DACA to kind of go through this process. And then I think for Lisbeth, as being someone who's fully undocumented without any protection, I think she's trying to push that even one step farther now, that I think it's important. You mentioned earlier you haven't asked anybody if they're undocumented, and people aren't necessarily willing to come out and say that. I think there's obviously, rightfully so, over the last 4 years, a lot of fear around coming out and being undocumented. And it was one of the reasons that Lizbeth really struck us as a truly unique lawyer was because she was undocumented. Watching her with her clients, people felt safe. People felt like she understood their experience, felt like she could really add something new to the table because of that, personal knowledge of what she'd gone through herself being undocumented in the US. So I think in many ways, we've been amazed that it's this true asset actually as an immigration lawyer, the experience she's had of being undocumented.
Yeah. Okay. So for people who are interested in the film, it basically covers a moment in Lizbeth Mateo's career where she is, to being very honest that she is an undocumented lawyer. She is advocating for other undocumented individuals who are at risk of deportation. And so, what about her story, which you mentioned that you were compelled when you met her, really made you think that this should be a film specifically?
I think there's a number of elements. One is just Lizbeth's, I think we were just so inspired by Lizbeth's approach to life. I mean, she lives in this deeply uncertain state of not having immigration status. She started law school before this case even happened. So she didn't even know if she was going to be able to practice law. And this idea that someone would believe so deeply in their dreams and their ability to just make something happen was really interesting to us. And then, of course, how that extends into the immigration space and how much gray area there is within immigration law. It was really intriguing. And where, I don't think, as someone who rarely thinks about this, but like where undocumented voices should be heard beyond activism in law, in politics. And this story and this moment in her career and her work with her pro bono client, Edith Espinal, who's actually living in sanctuary in a church, brings up a lot of these questions and allows us to get a viewer to like really think about, like you said, these parts of our immigration system that many of us never ever think about.
Yeah. I thought that the point that she was a community organizer before going into law was very interesting. It made me actually think of reading about other incredible lawyers who found those roots, such as even Barack Obama, who did community organizing before he became a lawyer and then, of course, became president. But there were many steps between that. And so I think there's something kind of really interesting in how her community organizing really fed her advocacy work and being able to use the law as a form of advocacy. So what was your guys' intent, since your filmmaking usually does have a purpose? You're trying to tell a story and create change. What do you think your film can do to help further the advocacy work that she's doing kind of as boots on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I think this film at its core is driven, and its campaign is driven entirely by Lizbeth and her goals. And we want to just play a small role in helping to support and elevate this existing community of people who are fighting on the front lines for immigration reform, for improvements to the asylum system, and who are just doing the work. Lizbeth is out there every single day, just working directly one-on-one with clients and doing that hard work. So, for us, the film is really, at the end of the day, at its core message, its goal is to support immigration lawyers like Lizbeth. And I think it's, and I think, if she's willing to risk everything to do that, to do this work, as is Edith, her client, I think all of us can be better allies when we, talk about privilege that you mentioned earlier. For us to advocate and to help support immigration law, we're not risking being kicked out of the country. Right. We're not risking ICE knocking down our door. And I think all of us, should recognize that with that privilege, I think comes some degree of responsibility to be a part of this.
Yeah, and specifically, we are lucky to be working with HBO. They really believe in the mission of this film. They're actually allowing us to do what they're calling impact screenings, like a week-long window that, our team organizes with, the American Bar Association. We just did one with amazing nonprofits in the space. And we've had over 40 events this fall where, Lizbeth is able to actually speak all virtually, which is kind of amazing because she's able to fit it into her incredibly busy, legal schedule. But she's spoken to now thousands of potential lawyers, of advocates, of viewers who can be, allies. And, we've actually raised thousands of dollars for her pro bono work and her work with asylum seekers like Edith Espinal, who's living in this church and sanctuary. So there's some more like concrete goals with the film as well, which has been kind of, during the silver lining of pandemic, has actually allowed us to do in a much broader way than normally would allow and get more people to actually hear and talk to Lizbeth directly.
Yeah. There's a silver lining to almost everything. So we can even find one to the pandemic, the fact that we're all, working from home. I think really telling these stories is so important because, I think storytelling is how a lot of us create our opinions around things. And, like I mentioned, just the small snapshot of immigration law I had by representing one client through her asylum process, the amount of paperwork that was required for that, the amount of, hoops that needed to be jumped through. I mean, it really does take armies of lawyers to be able to help people through this process. And so I think just by raising awareness and, putting herself out there, it shows other lawyers that, not only what's possible, but it is just that important that people need protecting. Yeah.
And you kind of brought up this interesting blend of Lizbeth's advocacy with the law. And it's something that I never really thought about. And some people kind of call it community lawyering, right? Where the majority, maybe 99% of Lizbeth's cases are like pretty straightforward, have a ton of paperwork, but there are these cases like Edith's where the legal system has failed in some way, or might be influenced by advocacy. And that's where it's really interesting how Lizbeth has been able to bring her experience as a longtime activist and really push politicians, push the system to support people like Edith. Edith, her asylum case was heard in Columbus, Ohio, which I didn't realize that your success rate with your asylum case is so dependent on where the case is being heard. These judges have quite a bit of discretion. And this judge in particular had like a 95% decline rate of asylum cases, and this community, this church in particular, really rallied behind Edith and didn't feel like that was right. And so now it's this interesting blend of law and advocacy. So the whole new world that as filmmakers we never had really experienced before, and kind of a role that a lawyer can play in very specific cases is be not just tell your client what to do, but empower your client to really fight for themselves. And I think that's what, Lizbeth has especially done with Edith. You see a little bit in the film how, Edith, she'll talk to you about it, how she started out, this woman in the church, she started out allowing other people to really drive her campaign, let her lawyers kind of take control. But when she brought Lizbeth onto the case, Lizbeth kind of took a different approach and was like, no, you need to be driving your own case, your own campaign. And she's really empowered Edith to now be her own best advocate. And so it's been a pretty cool transformation. We filmed this film over 3 years, and just from the beginning of filming with Edith to the end, seeing how much more of an empowered advocate and activist even for the rest of the people living in sanctuary who are less public has been really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think the role, and I'm the daughter of 2 lawyers. The law has been such a huge part of my life. I have always seen lawyers as being able to navigate the kind of secret rules of these systems. We go to school to kind of almost learn the secret language. A lot of it is Latin. And then you kind of learn how the system works, or at least hold the keys to figure out how the system works. And then it becomes your job to kind of shepherd people through it, because we can't ask individuals to manage that system. And then if you're ever at a point where you become the client, no matter what it's for, hopefully nothing really bad, or you might use your own law license. But, we all have things that come up where we have to talk to lawyers, even if it's just writing our will. And I think it's also very humbling when you as a lawyer even get in a situation where you don't know, you're not the expert, you don't know how to navigate it, and you have to fully rely on someone. I mean, even in taking wills and trusts, I can tell you when, you have kids and then you have to do all of these wills and trusts and make sure, all the paperwork's in order. And I mean, the packet comes and it's like an inch thick. And I consider myself a fairly bright person. I'm educated. And I'm not 100% sure every single word in those inches, you're kind of relying on the fact that I hired somebody who I believe is good at what she does. And, here's hoping that it says what I think it says, and it really, I think, opens your eyes to when you have a client who is truly from outside the system. And here, I think, many of Lizbeth's clients don't even have rights to the system because,
right.
they're fully outside the system. That role of the lawyer becomes so much more important because it is truly a privilege to be able to hold the keys to get somebody help. And I think that gets lost a lot. I think that gets lost in law school. I think it gets lost in the way that we move throughout the world and the focus on jobs and career paths and all that stuff to take this moment. And for the law students that are listening to this podcast, I think it is important to take a moment and say, what am I going to hold once I have this law degree? What does this law license give me that then allows me to do with it to help who I want to? And it doesn't have to be, I'm of the opinion that you don't have to always be fully, if you care about immigration and you don't feel like you can practice immigration law for whatever reason, that's okay. You can work for a firm and do pro bono work. You can do lots of other things. But I think there is this important element to it of if you're privileged enough to hold the keys to the system, we have to help other people walk through that system.
Yeah, I love that idea. Something that I did, not coming from parents who are lawyers, didn't even quite understand until we really had time to spend with Lizbeth.
Yeah, I think my basic understanding of law was how fixed it was too. I was like, oh well, it's just the law and it's this one thing. And I think what was fascinating with Lizbeth and Adith's situations and just immigration law in general is how affected it is by the whims of the current political climate, where as we've seen over the last 4 years, there's an immense amount of impact that politics and general kind of political will can have, from everything to how asylum law is defined and what refugee numbers are coming in, how we're handling detention. All of these things are really moving targets, and I think that makes the job of an immigration lawyer like Lizbeth even more complex of really trying to shoot at this moving target.
Yeah. And these cases can go on for so long that the target can move even for each individual client. What if you started a case under one, federal administration, finished it in another, or have ridden the wave through this administration through another? It can go on for a really long time because I think one of your goals is to just not get deported, make sure they don't get deported. So it can.
If you take Lizbeth's situation herself, she had her case opened by ICE first time almost 17 years ago, and then it was administratively closed by a judge who decided that this was not a high priority case. They were going to put it to the side. It stayed like that for almost 10 years. Then was reopened again, and then she's thrown back into the mix, and then it was closed, and then now just most recently in March of 2020 it was reopened again, and it's back on this docket, and she's back in court herself, hired her own lawyer to represent herself, where ICE is now coming after her for deportation proceedings in many ways.
Don't we all feel safer that we're going after people like Lizbeth?
It's crazy,
exactly.
Especially when her parents, her dad's brother is a U.S. citizen, and he's been in line to get his citizenship for the last 17 years. So it's not like her family isn't trying to make the system work, and she's a lawyer and she still can't navigate the system for her family. It's crazy. Like, it really is.
It is crazy.
Oh yeah, and the one other element of that was shocking was, she was on the system with her parents waiting in line to become a citizen in relation to, because of the family connection. But then when she turned 18, that resets and she goes through an entirely different process. So even though she waited for 5 years as a child trying to get in, it all then resets again.
Yeah. I think I remembered one other thing about immigration law and lawyers that I wanted to mention too. When I was doing the small amount of pro bono work, I was very young, like first year of practice. So just what everybody wants, like a first year attorney representing them. We did have supervising attorneys, thankfully, who had much more experience, but I was pretty fresh faced. And I remember my boss giving me a letter and a stack of business cards to give to my client. And they said, at the first meeting, you have to give her this letter and these business cards and tell her that she always has to have it with her, because if she's ever approached by anyone, she has to hand them this letter to say that she has representation. And I think that was another moment for me where, one, it was a good reminder of how much fear people who don't have documentation live under, because you don't know when you could be in a situation where you feel compromised, but also that importance of representation, because, that letter was very powerful for her, to know that there was somebody who was going to come a-calling, like if something happened. And a lot of people don't get to live with that privilege. And I think that, that's, even to the point that like Lisbeth needed her own lawyer to manage her own case, because that's how hard this stuff is. It's crazy. It's a really difficult system.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the power of storytelling, because I joke I have many jobs, but one thing I do is I do some small nonprofit work in the Bay Area, and my board of directors, we've been talking a lot about storytelling and how telling stories is one of the ways to really get people engaged to give financially, get people engaged to volunteer. That data is great, but storytelling should come first. And for those who want to hear about the person who's been teaching me about this, we have a podcast episode with Adrian, who founded an organization called Bayview Hunters Point Community Legal, which is now called Open Door Legal, but he is doing universal access to civil legal services in the Bay Area. He's amazing. And he is kind enough to loan me his free time, which does not exist, to talk to me about the nonprofit work that I do to help me be a better storyteller. So anyway, we've got a podcast episode with him. He's great. So anyway, for those, we'll link to it in the show notes. But Adrian's... Yeah, this is a good one. You guys should meet Adrian. Anyway, he didn't go to CMC, but he's still great. But so one of the things Adrian and I have been talking a lot about is the power of storytelling. And so when I was watching this film, it really spoke to me that, your guys have made it your career to try and evoke change through telling people stories. So what do you think is so unique about storytelling, in contrast to just talking about data? Like we've talked a lot of facts, like clearly we've all done our research, right, on this podcast, but like, what is it about a movie that's going to cause change different than us just talking about the needs of individuals in this situation?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think, we didn't plan on being storytellers. We very much, we went to CMC, which is a school that doesn't even have a film minor or a film major. And we were studying economics. We were really interested in development. We kind of we call ourselves accidental filmmakers because, a summer between sophomore and junior year, we spent 2 months living in this Guatemalan village and kind of happened into making a documentary. And we came at it from that side of wanting to create tangible change in the world. And we also didn't realize that the power of storytelling. When we released our film Living on $1 on Netflix in 2015, all of a sudden we had this huge, overwhelming wave of support and raised $2 million for this community within, a few months. And it's really that person. What we heard over and over and over again is like storytelling allows you to humanize an issue and put a face on an issue that statistics will never be able to do, and build this very human connection to real people, because often it's lost when you throw these stats around, or, you know, when you just kind of talk in this amorphous way. Instead, if you talk about Lisbeth and Edith, you are able to like really connect and empathize with other human beings that are being affected by these policies. And it's just that the filmmaking is really just this spark to change, right? It creates this emotional reaction. Storytelling allows you to connect, and what we try and do is just harness that 15 minutes after that someone watches a film and provide tangible ways to get involved, tangible ways to, like, you know, meet your own Lisbeth, your own Edith, because there are, you know, I think being able to volunteer locally and do things beyond just giving money can fundamentally change the way we see the world. So, yeah, Chris, anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that's right on, and I think, you know, we just wish as storytellers that more people would get the chance to meet Lisbeth, or to meet these people that we feel so lucky to have gotten to the chance to get to know and to learn from and to hear from. And I think, you know, as a community and as a society, we're strengthened by hearing from a broad and diverse set of stories and experiences. And so, you know, every film that we watch, whether we made it or not, you know, it expands your mind. It brings in a new perspective, a new person. And I think that empathy for others in the world around you is vitally important. And then with that empathy, like Zach said, how do you come out and drive change? And so for us, you know, we have we'll provide it in the show notes. We have a full kind of study and discussion guide around this film with extra resources to delve deeper, to understand the complexities of how this happened with Lisbeth, and more resources of how to get involved and to be a better ally, and to, if you're an immigrant yourself, follow in the footsteps of Lisbeth. And I think, you know, for those who are going to take that extra step, who don't just want to passively consume media, but get actively involved, those are the people that really excite us to reach with a documentary as well.
Yeah. And I think that for lawyers, or soon to be lawyers specifically, I think sometimes I am constantly reminded that because we have special skills and, like I said, special access, because we have the keys to the process, you know, that we have the ability to volunteer and do things in different ways. And that was struck with me even around the recent presidential election. I'm on many, many, many mailing lists, but one of the many, many mailing lists I am on was a call to action just for licensed lawyers. And it was basically like, if you are a licensed lawyer and you want to do volunteer work, here are the 7 things that you can do right now from your home during a pandemic. And I think that, you know, there's this overall call to action. And then I think we can look at these kind of specific groups that are maybe viewing your film. Or I think it's great that it's being shown at the ABA, and hopefully, you know, more often at law schools and, you know, bar associations, and to say, like, look at you group, here is what you get to do. Like, you have the keys to the process. So here's what you can do. And I think that kind of targeted volunteering is really interesting. And I feel like I've seen a little bit more of it recently. Maybe it's the political landscape where lawyers have become pretty important in defending a lot of people for various things. But it is felt in the last 4 years that we have needed the lawyers to save us some ways. And I think, you know, my business partner and I have tried to use the podcast to highlight how lawyers have been able to work in advocacy. And, you know, during the travel ban, we talked to law professors who were taking law students to the airports to try and help, you know, navigate some of that. And this idea that, like, some law professor with their team of third-year law students is at the airport trying to hand out pamphlets and make sure that people understood, you know, what they had access to, is a very powerful thing. So maybe out of this crazy time, we can appreciate that this, you know, certain little corner of the world of people who have these law licenses, that people who are educated can do some specialized work to help invoke change.
Yeah, and earlier you mentioned Kind, Kids in Need of Defense, as this
Yes.
amazing nonprofit that we also support, and we would encourage anybody to go volunteer pro bono hours to as a lawyer. And we've seen them in action in courtrooms. We've seen them just step in when there was a 6.5-year-old girl alone at the podium in an immigration court case, and as a friend of the court, a kind person walked up, and a kind lawyer, and stepped in to at least help in that moment. And you see this over and over again of what those pro bono lawyers can do. So definitely supporting on that side. And then if people want to support this film as well, to host screenings at your law firms and having these conversations. So Lizbeth can come and speak. We can do these Q&As. We've been doing countless of these events over the last couple months, and would love to delve deep with law firms and your teams to have these conversations and to get people more actively engaged.
Yeah. I mean, what's better than a Zoom movie premiere in your law firm? Nothing. Literally nothing. Our standards have changed.
We've even developed a CLE around the film. We're working on it with the ABA right now, and I think compared to the other offerings of CLEs out there, getting to watch a movie and having a conversation sounds hopefully a little bit more exciting.
Oh, I am rewatching this movie for my CLE. I am way behind on my CLE. Let me tell you, that's like 25 hours every few years. I have not done maybe one of those hours, but this isn't my year, so I can do my 25 hours next year.
Well, you can get a head start on it with hopefully it will be out in January. And if anyone has questions for us, and we're so lucky. I mean, you're only hearing Chris and I talk, and obviously it's probably difficult to even tell between us at this point. We're like the same person, but
that's how my business partner and I are too. That people can't tell us apart.
I don't know. We've just kind of morphed into one weird entity, but we have this amazing team we have who are really running this campaign on the ground, and incredible executive producers, and it really took a whole family to make this film and to like push this impact campaign. So if people want to go to undocumentedlawyer.org, you can immediately reach out. We'll have someone help you set up an event or find out how to get involved and how to support Lizbeth or Adith. So there's some easy access there as well.
All right. Well, that's awesome. And we will have all that information in our show notes. We'll also circulate it to our mailing list as well, because I think it would be great to have this film be shown in law schools around the country too. That'd be pretty exciting. Well, I so appreciate you guys taking time out of your pandemic day to hang out with me and talk about this stuff. I mean, I think, my final thoughts about this is just the important that the world needs really good lawyers. And so for our listeners that are in law school, no matter what your career goals are, you can still have one foot in the world of helping the people that need the most helping. And I actually learned that at a CMC event, I know, a really long time ago. Someone was talking about nonprofit work, and that it's very important to remember that you don't have to be all in, that you can just have a foot in both worlds. And I think that that's very true. And I think if all of us were able to kind of see advocacy work or any sort of work like that, where it's like, as long as you've got a foot or a toe to help a couple people through, then I think we'd have a lot more people with access to representation and what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. And you never know where that'll lead you. If you meet somebody amazing through the process, it can, maybe that becomes a whole foot and a leg before you know it. And so
I know, right? Once those law school loans are paid off, then you might have a lot more flexibility. I'm guilty. I was a big firm lawyer. I'm guilty of paying down my school loans. Guys, any final thoughts before we sign off?
No, I just really appreciate, I really appreciate having access to your audience, because I think, like you said, lawyers, and we've learned over the last 10 years of filming 2 major immigration pieces that there is, so much tangible power, and really when you do create, when lawyers do empower their clients, it really is this even larger ripple effect that goes beyond just lawyers. And we saw that with Lizbeth and Adith and the characters in our other films. And so thank you for seeing noticing us, I think, on Twitter and inviting us to the podcast, and really wonderful.
Awesome. Well, with that, we're out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. We will have all the information about Chris and Zach's work on our show notes and on our website. So if you'd like to learn more, please dig in. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or Alison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.